I think you're in for a treat with this panel. I assume that the title, Living Goddess, has really sort of intrigued you, as indeed it should. The goddess Devi is encountered in so many guises, but in Nepal, one of her guises is as a beautiful living child. She's always dressed in red. Here's the cover, here's the book. She's always dressed in red. She has this wonderful, exaggerated kohl eye makeup that touches her ears. Lots of jewelry, hair all piled up on top. And Durga, the goddess, is supposed to take up residence in her. There are so many questions that we don't know about her, and Isabella has been able to penetrate behind veils and veils of secrecy to get us answers. You know, this 3 to 4-year-old child is chosen from a Buddhist family, and then she has this very elevated role in which she is able, and in fact has sanction to rule. She is the one who gives the king of Nepal once a year his sanction to continue ruling. And then when she reaches menstruation, or if some drastic ailment happens which sheds blood, then she leaves and another living goddess is chosen. What must her life be like after that? Everybody has these questions. Few have the answers, and one of them is Isabella Tree. She's a biographer, a writer, a journalist, a travel writer. This is her 4th book, which has taken her several times to Nepal. In fact, she began traveling as a child, I believe, with her parents to Kashmir and Ladakh. And her earlier works have been 1991, 96, 2007, taking us from England to Papua New Guinea to Mexico. And today she is going to reveal a number of these secrets about the living goddess. Isabella, welcome.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Well, I'm delighted to be here to talk about this book. It's been a very, very long time coming. It's been 13 years. I thought it was going to take me about 2 or 3, but more about that later. I'm hoping that this is going to work. So, yes, that's the first slide. So this is where the living goddess comes from, not a million miles away from here in Nepal, a country that was only opened up to the outside world in the 50s, so a very closed society until that point. She lives in Kathmandu, the capital, in this rather beautiful palace called the Kumari Chen, which is just a stone's throw from the king's royal palace. So it's in the center of old Kathmandu, in the heart of the Durbar Square. If you may even have seen it if you visited Nepal, because it's one must-see on the tourist trail. She can show her face to foreigners, but foreigners cannot go inside the building. But as a foreigner, you can go inside, and if she feels like it, she'll show her face at the window. So when you are confronted with this rather daunting aspect, you have to walk inside between these 2 very stern guardian lions. And the first time I did it was, it's a very impressive experience. You walk out of the bustle and the noise and the horns and rickshaws of Durbar Square through a very narrow entrance that purposefully makes you lower your head so that you're already humbling yourself before the goddess. And you go inside, and this is where you can catch a glimpse of her if you're very lucky. Above that door, you can see a golden window, which only the living goddess can look through. And inside that window is an audience chamber where no layperson has ever been. This is where the king only and the person who governs the country and tantric priests can go. So there's an amazing throne room in there, which I've never seen, and very few people have seen, where she sits on her lion throne. So who is she? Well, as Vidya has already explained, she is taken from her parents when she's chosen when she's 2 or 3. She's taken from her parents and goes to live in the Kumari Palace, where she's looked after by caretakers. The man holding her is a son of the caretaker. The principal caretaker, is a woman who in effect becomes her surrogate mother. And these are in effect her surrogate brothers who are carrying her. On the right is the Hindu tantric priest Udab Kamacharya. So he's one of the most powerful tantric priests in the country. He is charged with looking after her from the Hindu perspective. Because she's worshipped by both Hindus and Buddhists, which is, as far as I know, it's virtually unique. One of the stipulations is that she cannot walk outside that house while she's still living goddess. Her feet cannot touch the ground. So when she's carried out, when she leaves the house, which is on about 13 or 14 occasions a year, when she goes on festivals, she is carried in the arms of her caretakers or in a palanquin, so she's heaved above the heads of the crowds by 4 very strong bearers in this beautiful palanquin. And once a year, she's pulled around the whole periphery of the old walls of Kathmandu in a gigantic golden moving chariot. And this is believed to re-energize and re-protect the city of Kathmandu. One of the conditions also is that she mustn't bleed. If she bleeds, it's believed that the goddess will leave her. So terrific care is taken about when she plays. She plays with the caretaker's children, and her own siblings can go and visit her in the palace. But she mustn't play with sharp instruments, and if she grazes or cuts herself, then it's believed the goddess will leave her. So another little goddess will have to be chosen to replace her. So inevitably, when she reaches puberty and she has her first menstruation, the goddess will leave her. So in order to preempt that, she's watched very carefully for the signs of puberty, and when that begins to make itself known, they start looking for another little child to take her place. She's also watched very, very carefully by the royal astrologers and tantric priests, because her demeanor and her face even, her health, is connected very strongly with the country. She is identified with the body of Nepal and with its people. So if she has a temperature, or if she's unhappy or unwell, if she's crying, this can have disastrous implications for the country. It could mean that there's going to be an earthquake or a drought or some terrible disease or civil unrest. So she's watched very, very carefully for the whole of her tenure. I first saw her when in a long time, in 1983, when I was a teenager. I was 18, and I was traveling with 3 friends from school. One of them, Charlie, my husband, is sitting here. This is us in Freak Street, looking a lot younger, and you can get an idea of what we did most of the time in Freak Street. But one thing we did suddenly realize, that quite by chance, while we were sort of hanging out on the tail ends of the hippie era, we rented a couple of rooms in Freak Street overlooking Durbar Square. And every morning we would open our shutters onto this exquisite building where the living goddess lived. And soon she became kind of part of our whole sort of what was going on in our heads. You couldn't but not try and imagine what was happening over there. In the evenings, when it was dark, you could see, and it was lit up from the inside, you could see this little figure dressed in red running along the corridors. So it was impossible not to try and imagine what was happening there. And I began to write about her in my diary, trying to make sense of it all, not with much success. Everywhere you look, we used to go and see her that's one thing we could do, was we could just dip into her little courtyard. And this is the inside of the courtyard, and she appears for the general public, for tourists, on that second floor at that very grand pair of it's 5 windows actually, and she appears in the middle. So quite often we would join the tourists and stand there and catch a glimpse of her. So as Vidya has described, she's very, very striking to look at. When you see her at her window, it's a moment you never forget. The most striking thing about her, perhaps, is that she is very adult in her demeanor, so she's very serious. People say that if you smile at a living goddess, or you make a living goddess smile, it's an invitation to heaven and you'll die. So this very composed, very sort of haughty demeanor is instantly very striking. She always has her hair piled up on her head, like the Buddha's Ushnisha, like the cranial mound, which is a sort of indication of sort of cosmic unity and order. And her eyes are always elongated like this. Her forehead with the third eye, this is something that she wears on her festival occasions. But she always has her eyes like this, and she's always dressed in red. So everywhere else in Kathmandu, wherever we went, she seemed to shadow us. Her name is on Kumari Cinema, Kumari Bank, beauty products. Kumari Jostics was a particular favourite of mine. But it was very difficult to find out much about her at all. One of the most striking things for me was that every year the king of Nepal would come to the Kumari house and bow before her feet and receive his permission to rule the country. So if she did not receive this blessing, which no one can ever witness except for the tantric priests and the royal astrologers in that throne room, if he didn't receive that blessing, disaster would happen for the country. And it's happened several times in the past. The most notable time in recent years was in 1954, when the Kumari refused to bless King Tribhuvan when he knelt at her feet. And no matter what King Tribhuvan tried to do, she refused. She would cry when he came up to the throne. And she wanted to bless his son, the Crown Prince Mahendra, who was standing nearby. And eventually, they didn't want to upset her, so they allowed her to bless King Mahendra. 2 months later, King Tribhuvan was dead and Mahendra was king. So it's firmly believed that she has the power to divine what's happening in the future. So she's watched very carefully for this blessing. And this is when she's carried around on her chariot around Kathmandu. The king will be on that palace balcony, watching her on the first day, and the blessing comes 3 days later. But apart from this is her in her chariot. Very difficult to take a photograph of her because there's kind of crowds and paparazzi all around her when this happens. But there she is in the middle, and there's royal astrologers and tantric priests on the chariot with her and her male caretakers. But apart from this, it's very difficult to find out anything about the reality of what happens to the Kumari. There are loads of rumours. One of the most prevalent of which is, how do you get a little child, a tiny toddler, and we all know toddlers and perhaps have some, how do you get a child to actually sit in a chariot for sometimes 5-6 hours at a time, completely placid, non-smiling? She doesn't eat, she doesn't drink, she's not excused to go to the loo, she doesn't move. How do you do that? So there's all these rumours about that they must be giving her drugs or alcohol. One particular hippie that we met in Freak Street was convinced they were giving her soma, the legendary hallucinogenic in the Rig Veda, and he was desperate to try and get his hands on some. But this myth is one of the strongest ones about her. And the other myth is that when they are dismissed, they're simply thrown onto the scrap heap, that these little living goddesses have no future. Either they're trafficked to Mumbai or Bangkok and they become prostitutes like tens of thousands of children in Nepal, or if they try and get married, any man who tries to deflower a Kumari is toast, basically. Snakes will come out of her vagina, terrible things will happen to him, very bloody, his head will blow up. All these stories pervade Freak Street about things that have happened to men who have dared to marry a Kumari. So in 1983, I left Kathmandu none the wiser. I was really resigned to the fact that I wouldn't be able to find out any more about her. One of the reasons these rumours persist is that the belief system from which the Kumari comes is a tantric belief system. It's very secretive, very esoteric, complex belief system, which can only be transmitted to people who have had Diksha, who are initiated. And you can only get this very secret information through years and years and years of study, of yogic meditation, and under the guidance of a personal guru. But then, in 2001, something terrible happened. You may remember this. This was the royal family massacre on June the 1st, 2001. This extraordinary event happened where the whole of the Nepalese royal family were blown away in one night. The guy on the left, the Crown Prince Dipendra, is believed, although many Nepalis refuse to believe this to this day, to have killed. He walked into the billiard room where all his family were assembled for drinks, for dinner, and shot his father in the head deliberately twice, moved on to his younger brother, his sister you see there, shot his mother. In all, 10 direct members of the royal family were killed that night. Then he put a gun to his head and was in a coma for 3 days as king before, again, succumbing to his wounds. So you have 11 members of the royal family being taken off in processions to Pashupati to be cremated. This was devastating for the country. Already the country had been under 5 years of Maoist insurrection, and the royal family massacre sort of threw the country into crisis. It precipitated the kind of unstable political events that were already happening. Birendra, in a sense, King Birendra, had been a mostly popular king, and he was a sort of stabilizing influence. Just his presence, his rather avuncular presence, was very stabilizing for the country. So as soon as he was killed, the Maoists began to take advantage, and the whole political situation was looking very unstable. His brother, King Gyanendra, was the only one who wasn't at that dinner party, and he assumed the throne. He was a very unpopular person in Nepal anyway, and to many people it looked like the fact that he hadn't even been there was implied that he was somehow complicit in the massacre. But what interested me most when I was following this news in the English papers was that a huge amount of focus was now being brought onto the Kumari. The Kumari who had reigned during the time of the massacre had now been dismissed. That always happens when a king dies, because her horoscope is very connected to the king. So as he died, she was dismissed, and there was a terrific haste to get a new Kumari on the throne, because this country was so unstable that that war and peace could literally depend on the little Kumari giving King Gyanendra her blessing. And the Maoists, who were becoming ever more forceful, had vowed never to bow to a Kumari. They were not going to accept the living goddess tradition, their secular movement. They were not going to allow the tradition to survive. And I suddenly realized this might be my last chance to go back to Kathmandu and actually find out what the Kumari is all about. This is the new little Kumari who was put on the throne after the massacre. She was only 2 or 3, absolutely adorable. And so when I went back to Kathmandu, I had several burning questions that I wanted to try and resolve if I could. One was, were there any truth to these rumors that I had heard about what happened to Kumaris after they were dismissed, and also what happened to them inside the Kumari palace? Were they happy? Were they bored? Were they lonely? What was their situation like? And what does the tradition mean for the people who actually worship her? And finally, I wanted to find out if there was anything she had to say to me as an outsider, as someone in the rest of the world. Was this just an anachronistic tradition that might disappear at any minute, that was something that was rooted completely in Nepal and had nothing to say to us, or did it have some deeper meaning that perhaps I could learn something from? So I decided to go back to Kathmandu and take as many years as it would. In the end, it was 13. But I decided to visit about twice to 3 times a year and until I had found the answers that would satisfy me. And one of the reasons it took so long was because I had to really gain the confidence and the trust of the people who guarded the Kumari, who guarded these tantric secrets, this belief system. This is an image of me doing a puja with Jujubai Shakya, who in the middle, who is the caretaker's husband. Wonderful, wonderful man. And then on the right is the head Buddhist priest who is in charge of the Kumari. He's called Manjushri Vajracharya. And I was deeply, deeply honored that after a while, once they saw that my intent was serious, they began to take me into their confidence. I didn't learn any tantric secrets from them, and I didn't ask to find out any either. But I felt that after the massacre, it sort of loosened things up a little bit. They were feeling very threatened by the fact that the Kumari tradition was under attack from the Maoists and the political instability altogether. So I sensed that there was a feeling that they wanted to open the doors just a little, just enough, to people that they could trust in order for them to see the value of what it was that they were protecting. And in particular, I began to, this is me with having a blessing from the Pancha Buddha, the 5 Buddhist priests who again are very closely connected with Kumari worship. But in particular, I began to interview ex-Kumaris. And I love this photograph because we've got all the ex-Kumaris in a row all together, the surviving ex-Kumaris. This photograph was taken in 2007. So sadly, the oldest one is no longer with us. But I just want to run through them because this will dispel most of the rumors already that still persist about them. On the left, you have Dil Kumari Shakya. She's only 4 foot tall. She was twice married. She quite often gives interviews, irate interviews to the press when she hears these rumors being bandied about that she was married twice and she didn't kill either of them. Next to her is Nani Shobha Shakya, 75, grandmother of 6. Next to her, Harshi Lakshmi Shakya. She was the first Kumari to pass her school leaving certificate, and now she's a senior nurse in Bhaktapur with 2 sons. Sunina Shakya next to her, 43, also a nurse in Bhaktapur. She was the first Kumari for King Birendra. Then we have Anita Shakya, who was the first Kumari I had ever seen. She is, I can't point, but she's just behind the desk. She was the one I had seen when I was 18 as a little girl at the window. And next to her is Rashmila Shakya, who here is 26 years old, and she's the one I've become closest to. She's the one I know best. And the one next to her was Amita, who is now studying at school. So obviously from this picture, several things are immediately obvious. They're not thrown onto the scrap heap when they leave as Kumaris. They find their feet in the mortal world. They marry, have children. They are honored for the rest of their lives. But I also learnt, and this is a lovely photograph of the eldest ex-Kumari being helped by Durga Shakya on the left, who is the Kumari caretaker's daughter. And she's a wonderful woman, and she's seen 5 Kumaris she's looked after through her lifetime. She's nurtured them as they've grown up, and then with enormous sadness in her heart, watched them go back into the world. But she still maintains a relationship with all the Kumaris who pass through the Kumari palace. So the Kumaris all come from this very small caste of Buddhist Shakyas. They're relatively affluent, they're educated, they claim to be descended from Shakyamuni Buddha himself, and they regard their role as Kumaris as their dharma, as their religious duty. They feel that they're doing something that is good for all mankind, for all sentient beings. It's a sacrifice, but it's a hugely important role, and they're honored to have done it. This is Rashmila when I first met her. She was 17, so she'd only been a few years out of being a living goddess. And she was wonderfully radiant, but very, very, very shy, could hardly speak. She was very nervous about speaking in front of anybody because she'd never conversed in that way. She couldn't remember being taken from her parents when she was 2 or 3. She was so small. She spoke very warmly about the Kumari house and said she'd been nothing but happy there, and particularly about the Kumari caretakers, who were her surrogate family. But her mother said that it was very traumatic, handing over her daughter. They do this willingly. They offer her up. But she found it very hard as a mother. She knew it was her religious duty to surrender her for this. But as a mother, she said it was very difficult. And going to the Kumari palace, she would only be allowed to bow before her like any other lay person coming to beg blessings. She couldn't cuddle her or talk to her in the way that she had done as her child. And when Rashmila, just her sisters, her elder sisters, were explained to me once that it was taking her, one of the most difficult things for her as a Kumari was literally finding her feet. Because in the Kumari house, there's just flat wooden floors. And so she can run along these floors, but she's never had to negotiate an uneven surface, or an uphill or downhill or potholes. So her sisters would describe to me taking her for a walk was like having this huge, heavy breathing, clomping horse next to you, because she literally found it so hard to maneuver on the surface of the road. But now you can see she's a beautiful, beautiful woman. She's eloquent. She's completely delightful, and she's become a great spokesperson for the Kumaris, and particularly dispelling all these rumors that journalists still keep churning out. They seem to kind of persist. It's almost as if the rumors are more attractive than actually what genuinely happens to the Kumaris. And she wrote this book called From Goddess to Mortal, which is a wonderful book which describes her life inside the Kumari Chen. And it also lays into a number of journalists and their sort of scurrilous reports. But while I was looking for ex-Kumaris, I also discovered that there were lots of other Kumaris, not just in Kathmandu, but there were lots of other traditions of living Kumaris permanently worshipped as living goddesses all over the Kathmandu Valley. And it now seems that this was a tradition that was prevalent in every town and every major city, and even some of the forts that guarded the Kathmandu Valley, that there was a living goddess that people could worship, that the locality would worship. Just one very quick word, because I know I haven't got too much time, but the Dana Kumari on the right, bottom right-hand side is an anomaly. She's a really interesting one because she's the only grown-up Kumari. And the reason for that is she's never bled. And so she is now in her late 50s, and she has never left the house where she was worshipped originally as a living goddess. But in addition to that, I discovered that this living goddess worship pervades all of Newar society, because the tradition is very much based in the Newar culture of the Kathmandu Valley. The Newars are the indigenous inhabitants of the Kathmandu Valley. And at every big family social occasion, whether it's a wedding or someone going off to Doha for a job, they will dress their smallest children, the littlest girl in the house, as a Kumari. She will be invested with the great spirit of the goddess, and she will be worshipped by everyone in her family, her father, her brothers, her grandfather, everybody. And also you have occasions when little girls, for a big special sort of local occasion, will all come together. This was when 365 little Kumaris all came together in Durbar Square to be worshipped by the general public. And this, I love the one arriving on her motorbike with her shades. She's absolutely adorable. But they all sat in this huge tent, and you joined a queue, and then you bowed and gave your offerings, a few rupees, some sweets, to every single living goddess in turn. And just as a worshipper, it was exhausting, going from one to the other. But what it impressed upon you every time you did it, this was the divinity or inside each little girl, every single little girl, not just these 365 little girls, but every little girl in the Kathmandu Valley is sacred. Every little girl in the world is sacred. I mean, the implications of this worship are huge. And of course, there are vestiges of it still in India. This is Kanya Puja during Durga Puja. But it seems really to have withdrawn a lot the ancient tradition of the mother goddess worship and the living goddess worship. Though we believe it was present in the Indian subcontinent, now really only exists in a permanent form in the Kathmandu Valley. And the reason for this is the valley was very difficult to get to. Nowadays you just fly in by a plane, but until the 50s, it was a really, really arduous journey, and the Kathmandu Valley always remained beyond the reach of the great empires. So none of the great Indian empires colonized Nepal, nor did the Chinese, and nor even did the British, though they did have their sights on it. But it was just too far for them to conquer. So the indigenous mother goddess traditions, boosted by the influx of tantric traditions from the rest of India, supported this general belief in the great mother goddess. So what does Kumari mean? Well, she is seen and worshipped on many, many different levels. This is a yantra, which I'm sure many of you are all familiar with. The diagram for the female sex, and it indicates the universal supreme mother goddess. Inside you have the bindu, the pinprick of creation, of existence, where everything comes from. And this symbol, this triangular symbol, embodying Shakti, female, divine, creative energy, is what the Kumari sits on her throne. It's hidden under her cushion. So wherever she's seated, there is a yantra underneath. And her red, her forehead is also painted with a yantra that is regarded by the caretakers as a yantra. And her third eye, through which she sees everything, is the bindu in the middle, the beginning and the end of creation. And she has a yantra mala, a necklace around her neck, which is, again, this symbol of the universal mother. So while I was trying to do all this research, extraordinary things were happening in Kathmandu, and I'll have to gloss over them because it was so fast-moving and extraordinary things were happening. But in a nutshell, the Maoists began to become ever more powerful, and their presence began to be felt in the Kathmandu Valley. There were King Gyanendra imposed a state of emergency, basically claiming power for himself. There were democratic uprisings against King Gyanendra. He was eventually deposed in 2006. There was a peace treaty with the Maoists, and in 2008, the Maoists were elected into a majority in a coalition government. And for the first time, we have a prime minister. For the first time in the history of the Kumari tradition, we have a prime minister kneeling at the goddess's feet in order to receive permission to rule the country. And what was even more amazing from my point of view was that the Maoists, who had pledged never to worship the Kumari, were forced by public opinion. Tens of thousands of people hit the streets to ensure that the Maoists would accept the Kumari tradition, and that even the Maoists would understand that the leader, the prime minister, and now the president of the country has to kneel before this little child, this little Buddhist child, in order to receive her permission to rule the country. And to Nehwaz, the reason that this extraordinary political situation didn't spiral into all-out civil war, into complete chaos, was because of an upsurge in Kumari Bhakta, in Kumari devotion. During these years, while there was sort of chaos and awful atrocities being mentioned in the newspapers every day, people were worshipping the Kumari more and more and more. This is just an indication of offerings that were made to the Kumari palace. The window was re-gilded, the arms on those beautiful goddesses were replaced, the finials were touched up. This was in 2007. This beautiful net was made by hundreds of women. It's sewn together with thread, with popped rice, which is like kind of popcorn. And they'd spent months doing this. It's like a veil of a bride that they dressed the front of the Kumari palace in. And this eventually will disintegrate, and the birds will carry off the popped rice, and the cotton will disintegrate, but it will spread blessings all over the valley. And to them, they felt that it was this, and this is just another dedication, of a silver palanquin, a solid silver palanquin, that was given at this time, during this very unstable time. And so to her devotees, this is what averted the country from war. It was this focus, this meditative focus on the loving kindness of the mother, and the spirit of inclusion that managed to avert the country from civil war and all-out disaster. So what did the Kumari say to me at the end of all this journey? Well, I think it's most simply put by this very, very simple gesture. Here I am just bowing in front of the little Kumari in the city of Patan, which is just outside Kathmandu. I think kneeling at the feet of a Kumari is a very profound experience. It changes the person doing it. It's not just an idea or a superstition or an empty sort of ritual. It actually changes the person doing it. There's a sort of surrender of ego that happens when you kneel. You actually kneel and press your forehead to the feet of a little child. And I tried to imagine what it would be like if I did this to my daughter, who, if she was a Newa, would have this, she would be dressed on some occasions as a living goddess, and I would be required to kneel at her feet. And actually it made me feel very uncomfortable because I realized that, you know, I would be surrendering my adult assumptions of control and power over her. Kneeling at my 8-year-old's feet, you know, was not necessarily for me going to be the best policy, and what might it make her feel, you know? But this is exactly the point. You're reversing the roles. And you're acknowledging something more fragile than you, but also more powerful and more precious than you. And worshipping a little goddess activates the divinity inside yourself. And for little boys, I think it's hugely important. If you're a Newa, you're brought up, you grow up with kneeling at the feet of little girls. This is my son, again at the feet of the Patan Kumari. But it changes, I think, for males in Newa society, how they regard women and children. It makes them think of them completely differently. And here is my daughter, again, who was completely thrilled by the idea of the possibility of being a living goddess. And she said to me, wouldn't it be amazing if I was a living goddess in England? My headmaster would be kneeling at my feet, my teachers, the Prime Minister. You know, the implications are absolutely huge. And I think at the end of the day, that is what it says to me, is how it changes. Because it's a regular thing you do every day, and it reminds you every day of the innate uniqueness of women and children, and it protects them for their future lives by having men involved in this practice. And I'd like to leave you really with just a last verse, a wonderful verse from the Uttara Tantra. Look upon a woman as a goddess whose special energy she is, and honor her in that state. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was very inspiring. We are, of course, ready to take questions, and I think the mic is going around. Yes? Yes, as soon as, right in the back there.
I've got 3 questions, really. I'll try and ask them quite fast. The first is about the Buddhistic tradition, which is kind of a philosophy of life and not really a religion. So it's against, technically against deification. The second is, how do you link this to the other kind of mother goddesses like Patini and Kaliyama and people like that, and traditions there? And the third question is, you hear so much in South Asia and maybe even in China of the trivialization of the girl child and the position of, preferring boy children and killing of girl children. So how does this tradition weave into that culture?
Well, I think first of all, the thing about the Buddhist aspect is that this is a tantric, this is Vajrayana Buddhism. So it's a specific type of Buddhism, and it's very close to Hindu Tantra as well. Sorry, what was the last part of your question?
Trivialization of the girl child.
Trivializing the girl child. I mean, this is the exact opposite. It's reminding everybody not to do that. That I think is what is so extraordinary about this tradition. And really, I think one of the reasons there's so many rumors around the Kumari tradition is because in the rest of the world, even nearby, even close here in India, we just can't imagine that there is anywhere left in the world where a little girl is genuinely worshipped.
Could we allow others, please?
What has this tradition resulted in, say, literacy rates or mortality rates within these communities compared to the communities that don't worship the living goddess? And what do you think the future of the living goddess tradition is within this community? So first, is there a sociological difference between the communities that do worship and don't worship in their treatment of the girl child?
Well, the people she comes from are already very comparatively affluent and well-educated anyway. They're high caste Buddhists, which is another story. But they live in the center of Kathmandu, so they are professionals. They're often in government. They are teachers. They're traditionally goldsmiths by trade, so they are already very well-educated and very comparatively well-off. The Kumari herself, there has been a lot of debate about that recently, because originally as a living goddess, you were believed to be omnipotent, so you didn't need to be educated. But now, thanks to my friend Rashmila and subsequent Kumaris, the living goddess, while she is in position, is given private teaching for 3 or 4 hours a day, and during those hours, tourists aren't allowed to come and interrupt her, and no devotees can come and worship her. So she is kept up to standard with her peers. So when she leaves the Kumari house, she can go straight into school and be at the same level as her peers. So that's a dramatic change that they've modernized to try and help that transition for when she leaves the palace. And as far as I can see, for the central Kumari in Kathmandu, she it is alive and kicking. That tradition is very, very strong, and there's this very, very strong belief that if you stop worshipping a Kumari, then the male and female is out of kilter, it's out of balance, and then the world spirals into a kind of chaos and greed and selfishness. It's that reminder of the motherliness in all of us that she brings, and that's the peace that she relies on.
Two questions. What criteria are used to choose this little girl as a Kumari? And the second is, when so many Kumaris are worshipped and revered all over the valley, is there any statistic to show that there's less rape, or that women are revered more as a result?
There's certainly within the Newar society, the way they regard women is completely different, as far as I can see. For instance, just if you go over to Kumari household, a woman is very much treated as an equal with a man. And there are traditional taboos that the Newars, through Kumari worship and tantric worship, have managed to overcome, that Orthodox Hinduism have been trying to impress upon the valley, and they cleverly get around that. So, for example, one of the moments when a young girl is revered as a goddess in her house, she joins a lot of other girls, and there's a life cycle ritual called E, where she is dressed as a Kumari, as a goddess, and she is married to a bell fruit, which symbolizes a god. And so this means that she is already married, she's already powerful, and when she eventually marries her mortal husband, if he doesn't treat her well, he's got a first husband, a god, to look out for. So there are these very clever protective inbuilt structures in Newar society that definitely protect women against the sort of, the androcentric sort of weight. Oh, and how she's chosen. Well, I think they used to be chosen through quite a complex matter. Nowadays it's quite simple, but in the old days you used to have 32 lakshana, the divine characteristics that a bodhisattva and the Dalai Lama himself has. But some of them are rather wonderful. She has to have the voice of a duck, and legs like a banyan tree, neck like a lion, and that kind of thing. But I think really now what happens is that her horoscope is checked with that of the king, but now it will be the president, to make sure that there are no conflicts, that her horoscope is a strong one. And they check her for physical, she can have no physical disfigurement, so no smallpox scars or birthmarks. And I think they're basically looking for a child that is very composed. So she's chosen by the royal astrologers and tantric priests, and it's really a very simple selection from the 4 or 5 little girls who are put forward for it.
There's a gentleman out there.
Well, I wish all societies could worship girl child. My question is about modern Nepal society. Do women, are they reaching up to the top echelons of the modern working life? One. Number 2, what is the position of women? Do they have dowry, and do they have inheritance, right to property and things like this? How is Nepal society organized towards the woman as a right, on a right basis?
Well, I can't tell you about women really anywhere else in Nepal, because my study has really just been basically on the Kumaris themselves. And they're given a pension for life by the government. They're also given money for when they marry, if they marry. But again, in Newar society, it's not as frowned upon. If you can be a perfectly respectable single woman. It's not looked upon as a failing if you're a single woman. And equally, it's not such a serious offence, as it were, as if you're a widow. Again, because you are already, symbolically at least, through your life cycle ritual, married to a god. I don't know about female property rights in Nepal, I'm afraid.
A couple of questions on the left. Yes, sorry. There's the lady in red. After that, please.
Thank you for a very interesting talk. I was curious if we were right in equating this tradition with the Mother Goddess tradition, because it seems there are different things that are being looked at, especially in this, because we're looking at a girl child who's not stepped into reproduction or fertility. We're looking at a girl child who's being worshipped because there are certain criteria that are being matched. She's not bleeding, right? So in terms of looking at this as various stages of worshipping the divine in the woman, or a female principle, where do you put this on that continuum?
Well, it's interesting, but she is worshipped. I mean, when I first saw her in Freak Street, you know, in '83, I was sort of confused by how this little girl could be the huge, supreme mother goddess. And in a way, she reflects all, you know, like the goddess does, all aspects of the goddess. So people worship her in different, you know, what they see in the living goddess is something completely different to what, you know, she's worshipped on many, many levels, is what I'm trying to say. But one of the reasons she wears red is because she is dressed like a bride. So, and it's important that she hasn't bled because she has all creativity, all her creative potential still inside her. None of it has been dispelled by childbirth or menstruation. So it's like the most powerful female energy because it has not yet been dispelled.
Good morning. I have a question. I wanted to know that apart from the goddess aspect of it, to what extent do you think that this system is perpetuating a kind of an over-sexualization of children at a very, very young age?
I don't think it is, quite honestly, and I think there are several, after the Kumaris are dismissed, there are several important life rituals, life cycle rituals that happen that are again very, very important because they establish the self-belief in a girl. After the ritual of E, where she marries a fruit in the form of a god, there is another ritual which is all about when she has her first menstruation, when a number of little girls are closed in a darkened room. And again, terrible things have been said about this, but everyone I've interviewed who've ever done it have said it's fantastic fun and it's like just a huge sleepover. And they're brought sweets and they dance and they sing and they do sort of Bollywood dances and stuff. And they're enclosed for 13 days. And then when they, so they don't see the sun. And then when they come out, they are ritually empowered by the sun. They see the sun again. And so, to my mind, this is such an empowering thing. It's quite the opposite of objectification of young girls. I think it's an incredibly positive, reaffirming sort of an idea of the acknowledging the future potential of a girl as a woman, but not in any way objectifying her, making her her own person.
There's one right at the back and one over on that corner.
Hello. Slightly personal question maybe, but are you a believer and do you have faith? And if not, or if so, did this journey change that in any way?
I wouldn't say I'm a believer. I've always been very attracted to different religions and different beliefs. I'm hugely admiring of people who do have spiritual belief, though I don't think I have it myself. But as I say, I think what changed me was this understanding of what religious belief can do to a person, how it actually psychologically and changes you. And if you're doing rituals like this as worshipping living goddesses every day of your life, it changes you as a person. And that's, I think, what I came away with, which most impressed me about its effect on me anyway.
Hello. You have been face to face with Kumaris. So my question is that are those Kumaris are really enlightened beings or just selected on the basis of preset protocols?
They're not in any sense like selected like a kind of Dalai Lama, where they're a reincarnation, considered to be a reincarnation of anything. They are really manifestations of the goddess. So they don't. It's just their reactions that are predictive. They can't actually speak and predict things in that sense. Is that what you're kind of getting at? And are they enlightened? Well, it's a sort of, who am I to say, really? But when I'm talking to ex-living goddesses, when I talk to Rash Miller about how she felt as a goddess, and she's a child, remember, so you know, she couldn't remember what it was like when she was 3 or 4, but from the age of 8 or 9 onwards, she said whenever she put particularly the empowering Naga necklace around her neck, she felt different. She felt more powerful. She felt like the goddess was activated within her. And that's one of the reasons that she said that it was easy to sit still on the throne, because she felt strong and big and powerful. She had become the goddess.
We probably can take 2 more questions. Yes, shall we take the 2 of you here in the front?
This is just one is a comment, one is a question. I find it interesting that you find that the Kumari as a point of political stability in Nepal, when everything else kind of just went to pieces. The monarchy went, the whole royal family was. So the Kumari provided a kind of point of political stability, and that is really unusual because this is a tradition that really has nothing to do with the politics of Nepal otherwise. So would you comment on that? The other is a kind of an answer to the question the lady in the back asked, that Kumari Puja is very much a part of Durga Puja, of the Mother Goddess worship in Bihar, Bengal, Assam, all over Eastern India, and it is a very live tradition. And the whole idea of Durga as Kumari marrying Shiv, and you know, that marriage actually doesn't take place finally. This is part of the Devi Puran, and that's why it's a very complicated story, so I won't go into that. But the 3 sands at Kanyakumari being 3 different colors, the black sand is her kajal, the red is the kumkum, and the white is the chandan. So it's very much a part of the tradition of Devi Puja, you know, which has become this tantric Kumari worship in Nepal. But my question was on how do you see this Kumari Puja, is a very ancient tradition, as providing political stability now in Nepal?
I think you're absolutely right. I think it does, and I think a lot of people were completely taken by surprise, because most people assumed that the Kumari and the king had this sort of relationship, and that when the king was deposed, the Kumari would fall by the wayside as well. But then what sort of emerged was actually that the Kumari tradition is much, much older than the Shah kings, or even the dynasties of the Malla kings who came before, who also worshipped Kumaris. It's a much, much older tradition than anyone commonly believes or knows about in Nepal. Going back to the sort of, certainly the 13th century, we have ritual texts talking about it, but it probably goes back to the 7th and 8th centuries too. So now I think there's an understanding that this is older than kings, and it's more important that this tradition carries on and continues throughout whatever turbulent years are ahead. I mean, it'll be very interesting if a Maoist president actually has to kneel physically to her feet. But certainly there is a will that this should happen.
The last question.
Hello? Yeah. You mentioned a lot about how long it took to gain the trust of the priests and the caretakers, and how it's such an intimate and secretive thing. And so I was wondering if you faced any resistance in actually trying to share all these secrets with the rest of the world. I mean, I think that's sort of a debate when you focus so much of your time and energy on an area of study. It's one thing for you to garner that trust, but was there any negativity in trying to share that with everyone else?
Not really, because I wasn't interested in exposing any tantric secrets or getting into, as if I could. I mean, that would be decades and decades of kind of devotion and study, and if I had done that, I probably wouldn't want to tell anybody anyway. I would be committed to secrecy. So all I was trying to do was to have an understanding of how she is worshipped and what it means to the people who worship her. And she's worshipped on so many levels. So the tantric priests who spoke to me they revealed enough about the esoteric worship of her for me to understand. And these were things that are really out there already, but that made a sense of how they view her and how they worship her. But as for the rituals and what actually happens inside the house, I don't know, and I wouldn't have gone there.
Isabella, thank you for these fascinating glimpses into a quite extraordinary tradition. And thank you all for being here.